She gave him everything. He took it all, and then decided she knew too much to stay alive. If you've ever watched someone smile while they buried you, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because the woman in this story didn't fight back with lawyers or tears. She fought back with something far more dangerous. A plan 6 years in the making. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The morning Vivian Mercer lost everything, she wore a pale gray dress and her mother's pearl earrings, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap like a woman waiting for a train she already knew was going to hit her. The courtroom on the 14th floor of the Dirksen Federal Building smelled the way all courtrooms in Chicago smelled. Recycled air, old wood, and something underneath both of those things that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it either. The overhead lights gave everyone's skin a faint yellow cast. The gallery was full. It was always full when Dante Moretti came to court, because watching Dante Moretti in a courtroom was like watching a man walk through fire without getting his shoes dirty, and people paid attention to that kind of thing. Dante sat at the opposite table looking the way he always looked, unhurried, expensive, vaguely amused by everything happening around him. He was 53 years old and still had the physical stillness of a man who had never once in his life been genuinely surprised by anything. His suit was charcoal brioni. His cufflinks were matte black. His attorney, Vincent Crowe, sat beside him with a leather portfolio open across his knees and a pen moving steadily across the legal pad. And the two of them together had the quiet, functional energy of a machine that had been running without maintenance issues for 20 years because it had never needed any. The judge, the Honorable Raymond Whitfield, had been on the bench for 11 years. He was 71 and efficient and not unkind, but he had a way of looking at women in his courtroom, particularly women in divorce proceedings, that wasn't hostile exactly, more like tired, the way a doctor looks at a patient who keeps coming back with the same complaint. He had already made up his mind. Vivian could see it in the set of his shoulders. She had seen it building for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. 42 days of sitting in that chair while Crowe's team dismantled her piece by piece with the systematic thoroughness of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. Expert witnesses who testified she was financially reckless, citing investment decisions she had made in 2019 that were now being characterized as borderline fraudulent. A forensic accountant who laid out, with extensive charts and very small type, evidence of what he called compulsive spending and hidden personal accounts. Accounts Vivian had never opened, carrying her signature on documents she had never signed. A psychiatrist named Dr. Harold Fenwick, who spoke for 4 hours about his clinical evaluation of Vivian Mercer, and concluded with quiet, devastating authority that she exhibited markers consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, impulsive decision-making, and a pattern of delusional thinking that made her unfit to manage significant financial assets. She remembered the way Fenwick had said the word delusional, the careful way his mouth had formed it, the way he had glanced toward Dante's table once, quickly, before looking back at the judge. She had written the word down on her legal pad and underlined it twice. Vivian's attorney, Naomi Brooks, was 44 and had been practicing family law for 16 years and was genuinely one of the best in Chicago. But they had both understood coming in that this was not a clean fight. Naomi had told her that in their first meeting, sitting in a corner office overlooking Michigan Avenue with 2 cups of coffee between them that nobody drank. She had leaned forward and said, "Vivian, I need you to understand something before we go any further. Dante Moretti has never lost a legal proceeding in his life. Not civil, not regulatory, not anything. That is not an accident." Vivian had nodded and said, "I know. I'm not saying we can't fight. I'm saying you need to know what you're walking into." "I know what I'm walking into," Vivian had said. "I helped build it." Naomi had looked at her for a long moment after that. Something in the attorney's expression had shifted, just slightly, the way a door shifts when the wind changes direction outside the house. She hadn't asked what Vivian meant. She had filed the motion the following morning. Now it was Tuesday, the 14th of October, and Judge Whitfield was reading the final ruling from the bench, and Vivian sat with her hands in her lap and let the words fall over her the way you let cold water fall over you when there is no choice but to stand in it. The marital estate, valued at approximately $2.3 billion. Moretti Holdings, its subsidiaries, its intellectual property, its real estate assets in Chicago, New York, and Miami. The private equity portfolio, the investment accounts, the Glencoe House, the Aspen property, the penthouse on Lakeshore Drive. Personal assets including art holdings and vehicle collections. All of it, in its entirety, awarded to Dante Moretti. Vivian was awarded a lump sum settlement of $4 million and the right to vacate the marital residence within 30 days. $4 million. She had spent more than that developing the security architecture that became the core product of Moretti Technologies in 2014. She had spent 18 months in a rented office in Wicker Park with 2 graduate students from Northwestern and a whiteboard covered in notation that nobody outside that room understood, and what came out of it had eventually been valued conservatively at $600 million. $4 million. Dante turned in his chair and looked at her. He had a particular smile. Most people would have called it subtle, just a slight lift at one corner of the mouth, a small softening around the eyes. But Vivian had been married to him for 9 years, and she knew it the way you know the sound of a specific floorboard in a house you've lived in long enough. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't even satisfaction exactly. It was the expression of a man acknowledging that something he had built was working exactly as designed. He believed this was the end. He believed she was erased. Vivian held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away, reached into her handbag, removed a small black encrypted flash drive, and slid it across the table toward Naomi. She said quietly, "Now." Naomi was already moving before the word finished leaving Vivian's mouth. "Your Honor." Naomi's voice cut across the shuffle of papers and the low murmur of gallery conversation with a precision that stopped everything. "Your Honor, I need to request an emergency continuation before this court adjourns. My client has just presented newly discovered material evidence of significant criminal conduct directly relevant to the proceedings." Whitfield looked up from his papers. His expression moved through several phases rapidly: irritation, consideration, something that might have been concern. "Counsel, the ruling has been delivered. This court is—" "Your Honor, the material involves evidence of fraud upon this court." Naomi's voice was even. "Perjury, racketeering, criminal conspiracy directed against my client and against the integrity of these proceedings. I am asking for 30 minutes. If I am wasting this court's time, sanction me. But I'm asking you not to leave this bench before you have seen what is on this drive." The room was very quiet. Vincent Crowe was on his feet. He was 61 and silver-haired and had the kind of face that looked good on the cover of law journals, and when he spoke there was a particular note in his voice. Not quite anger, something more controlled and more dangerous, the way a very large dog sounds just before it decides. "Objection. Objection strenuously, Your Honor. This is a transparent and desperate attempt to delay a lawfully rendered decision. My client has—" "Mr. Crowe." Whitfield's voice was quiet and very final. "Sit down." Crowe sat. Dante had not moved. He was still turned slightly in his chair, still watching Vivian, but the small smile was gone now. Something else was happening behind his eyes, something Vivian had only seen there a handful of times over 9 years. It wasn't quite worry. It was closer to the first moment of cognitive dissonance, that fraction of a second when a pattern you have trusted completely produces a result you did not expect. The room was called back to order. The drive was authenticated through the court's technical system, and then the courtroom lights dimmed and the projector mounted above the judge's bench came alive, and Vivian sat very still with her hands folded in her lap, and she breathed. What appeared on the screen was not a document. It was not a financial record. It was surveillance footage, high definition, date and time stamped in the lower right corner, camera angle suggesting a fixed mount positioned above and slightly to the left of the frame, looking down at a room that anyone who had ever been inside Moretti Technologies' corporate headquarters would have recognized immediately. The secure command center on the basement level, subfloor 2. The room that officially did not exist. The footage showed 3 men sitting around a rectangular table. The first man was Dante Moretti. The second man sitting beside him with his leather portfolio open and his silver pen working was Vincent Crowe. The third man seated at the end of the table with a glass of water and a loose-leaf folder was Marco Bellini, Dante's consigliere, officially listed as a senior risk management consultant for Moretti Holdings, functionally the operational spine of everything Dante ran that never appeared in a quarterly report. The timestamp in the lower corner read 14th March, 7 months earlier, 6 weeks before the divorce proceedings formally began. The audio was clean. Vivian had designed the system herself. She had designed it to be clean. The voice coming from the speakers was Dante's, unhurried and exact. The same voice he used in board meetings. The same voice she had once found compelling in the way you find a very sharp instrument compelling before you understand what it's for. The accounts need to be operational before the filing date, not after, before. I want the documentation ready to surface in discovery. Her name on every one of them. The signature work has to be Castellano's best. If it doesn't hold up under forensic review, then it costs us more than it saves. Crow's voice, confirming. The Fenwick evaluation is locked. He delivered the full clinical package last Thursday. Delusional disorder, impulsive financial behavior. It's thorough. It'll stand. What about Whitfield? Dante's voice. A pause. Then Crow again. Whitfield's been managed through the Lakeview Group since 2021. He won't create problems. On screen, Dante nodded once, the same nod Vivian had seen 1,000 times. The small, conclusive movement that meant a matter was resolved and no further discussion was required. Then Bellini spoke, and he spoke quietly. And what he said was precise and entirely without effect, the way men speak about logistics. What happens with the woman after the settlement finalizes? Dante was quiet for a moment. He reached for his water glass, took a slow drink, set it back down. She'll disappear, he said. Quietly. Before anyone starts asking about the money, make sure the timing gives us buffer. I don't want it looking reactive. The footage continued for 11 more seconds. Then it cut. The courtroom was silent in a way that courtrooms rarely are. Not the working silence of professional people engaged in process, but the airless, suspended silence of a room full of human beings who have just heard something their nervous systems have not yet finished processing. The woman in the gallery nearest the center aisle had both hands pressed flat against her mouth. A junior attorney at the defense table had his pen motionless in the air above his legal pad, frozen mid-notation. Judge Whitfield sat with both hands on the bench in front of him, very still, looking at the now dark screen. Vincent Crow was on his feet again, and this time the controlled note in his voice was gone. Your Honor, the provenance of this material is completely unestablished. This could be fabricated. This could be... Mr. Crow. Whitfield's voice came out low and rough, like a man who had just surfaced from cold water. Sit down and do not speak again without my permission. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Naomi was standing. Her voice, when she spoke, was careful and precise and completely steady. Your Honor, the footage originates from a surveillance system installed in the sub-level command center of Moretti Technologies' corporate headquarters in 2017. The system was designed and personally implemented by my client, Vivian Mercer, during her tenure as the company's chief technology officer. The system architecture includes cryptographic authentication protocols that make digital alteration technically verifiable, and in this case, verifiably absent. The footage is authenticated, the audio is authenticated, chain of custody documentation is included in the supporting materials on that drive. Whitfield looked at Vivian. Vivian looked back at him. She had designed the system in 2017 because she had understood, even then, even before the marriage had fully become what it eventually became, that she was building something inside a structure she did not entirely control, and that structures you do not control can be turned against you. She had not known exactly how or exactly when. She had known it the way you know weather is coming, not the specifics, just the quality of the air. She had never mentioned the system to Dante. In 9 years, he had never found it. That was the thing about Dante Moretti's empire. It was vast, and it was heavily defended, and it was ruthless. And for 20 years it had been untouchable because Dante was meticulous about eliminating threats he could see. He had simply never developed the habit of worrying about the ones he couldn't. Vivian had understood that about him a long time ago. She had built her answer accordingly. Judge Whitfield called a 30-minute recess. Within 15 minutes, the recess had been extended. Federal prosecutor's office was contacted. The courtroom was sealed. People in the gallery were told they could not leave. There was a brief low-grade commotion near the defense table. One of Crow's junior associates stood up and tried to say something about client privilege, and the bailiff put a hand on the young man's shoulder and said something quietly that made him sit back down very quickly. Dante had not moved. He sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, very still, looking at nothing in particular. The arrogance was still there. It was structural, built into the way he held his spine, but something underneath it had shifted, and Vivian could see it the way you can see a crack in a wall that has been there for years, hairline thin, before the water gets inside and the whole thing opens up. He turned to Crow. His voice was barely audible. "How?" he said. Crow didn't answer. He was staring at his portfolio. His pen was not moving. Dante turned back. His eyes found Vivian across the room, and for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment between the man who had run Chicago's underworld for 2 decades and the woman he had spent 9 months trying to erase. Something crossed his face that was not anger and was not calculation. It was older and simpler than either of those things. It was the expression of a man realizing that he had made a very fundamental mistake about who he was dealing with, and that the realization had come approximately 6 years too late. Vivian did not look away. She had sat in this chair for 42 days while strangers testified that she was delusional, reckless, and mentally unfit. She had listened to her signature forged on paper. She had heard a doctor describe her psychology to a room full of people using a clinical language that bore no relationship to any internal experience she had ever had. She had watched the man she had spent 9 years of her life with reduce her to a $4 million figure on a settlement sheet, and she had sat very still and breathed, and she had waited. She was still waiting, not for much longer. Outside the sealed courtroom, Chicago continued. The L train rattled its route above the river. Lunch hour traffic moved its usual crooked geometry along LaSalle. In the Moretti Technologies office tower 11 blocks north, 43 floors of employees were going about their Tuesday morning in complete ignorance of what was unfolding 14 floors below street level in the federal building. Marco Bellini, who was not in that office tower but was instead having lunch at a restaurant on West Randolph, had not yet checked his phone. He would, soon. By the time the recess ended and Judge Whitfield returned to the bench with 2 federal prosecutors standing at the back of the room and a U.S. Marshal positioned outside the door that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier, Dante had not spoken again. He sat the way he always sat, straight-spined, hands flat, eyes level. But the quality of it had changed. He looked, for the first time in Vivian's memory, like a man in a room he had not chosen. Whitfield looked out at the courtroom for a long moment before he spoke. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man doing arithmetic in real time, measuring the distance between what he had believed this morning and what he was being asked to believe now, and finding the calculation disturbing. The divorce ruling entered earlier today is hereby vacated pending further review, he said. All associated orders are stayed. The court is further ordering an immediate freeze on all financial accounts associated with Moretti Holdings and its identified subsidiaries, pending coordination with federal authorities. He paused. His hands were very still on the bench. I'm going to ask the individuals named in the material evidence presented this afternoon to remain in this courtroom until federal counsel has had the opportunity to... Vincent Crow stood up. He had his portfolio tucked under his arm, and his coat was buttoned, and there was something almost dignified about the way he stood, except that his face was the color of old concrete, and the hand holding the portfolio was shaking. Your Honor, I need to advise my client of... Mr. Crow, said one of the federal prosecutors from the back of the room, and there was something in the way he said it that made everyone in the room understand simultaneously that Crow was no longer Dante's attorney in any operative sense. Please take your seat. In the gallery, 3 journalists who had been covering the Moretti divorce as a society story were now staring at their phones with the focused, slightly glazed expression of people who had just watched their story change categories entirely. Vivian sat with her hands in her lap. Naomi leaned close and said something quietly near her ear, and Vivian nodded once. Across the room, Dante was looking at her again. He had opened his mouth, just slightly, just enough. And she thought he was going to say something. Her name, maybe, or a number. Men like Dante always had a number ready, a figure so large it was supposed to short-circuit every other calculation. She had seen him use it before. She had seen it work. He closed his mouth. The door at the back of the courtroom opened. The sound that came through it, before it swung shut again, was the sound of movement in the hallway. Multiple footsteps, professional and unhurried. And then the door opened fully, and the first of the federal agents came through, and Vivian finally let herself take a full breath. It tasted like recycled air and old wood, and something underneath both of those. It tasted, she thought, like the first morning of something. She didn't let herself smile. Not yet, because she knew something the rest of the room didn't know yet. Knew it the way you know a storm that you have been watching from a great distance has finally, inevitably, made landfall. The footage on that drive was only the first file. There were 47 others. The federal agents came in fast and they came in quiet, which was somehow worse than if they had come in loud. There were 6 of them through the main door, and 2 more positioned at the side exit that led to the judge's corridor, and they moved with the practiced, unhurried efficiency of people who had done room entry procedures enough times that the choreography had become muscle memory. Dark jackets with yellow lettering across the back. Hands visible. Faces carrying the particular blankness of professionals who understood that displaying emotion during an arrest was a form of unprofessionalism they could not afford. The lead agent, a woman, mid-40s, hair pulled back from a face that had been outdoors in real weather recently, walked directly to the center of the room and identified herself as Special Agent Renata Cross, FBI Chicago Field Office, and said that she had warrants for the detention of Vincent Crowe and Marco Bellini for questioning in connection with an ongoing federal investigation, and that she was further requesting that Dante Moretti remain in the courtroom pending review of additional warrant materials that were in transit. She said all of this in the tone of someone reading a grocery list. Vincent Crowe did not move immediately. He stood with his portfolio against his chest and looked at Cross with an expression that had traveled a long distance in the last 40 minutes, from the controlled authority of a man who had spent 3 decades being the most important person in most rooms he entered, to something much older and much smaller. His jaw was working slightly, the way jaws work when a person is running calculations they already know the answer to. "I want to speak with my own attorney," he said. "You're entitled to that," Cross said. "That conversation can happen at the field office. Right now I need you to step away from the table and come with Agent Pruitt." Crowe looked at Dante. It was the look of a man searching for an instruction, a signal. Any small gesture that indicated the infrastructure he had operated inside for 20 years was still functional. That the machine was still running, that this was a manageable situation of a kind that had been managed before. Dante was looking at the table. Crowe set his portfolio down. He took off his reading glasses and folded them very carefully and put them in his breast pocket, and then he walked with Agent Pruitt toward the side door, and his footsteps on the hardwood were the only sound in the room for approximately 4 seconds. Marco Bellini was brought in from the hallway. He had been picked up from the restaurant on West Randolph. They could tell by the fact that he still had a cloth napkin tucked into his collar, which he removed with one hand as the agents walked him through the door, the gesture quick and automatic, and somehow the most human thing Vivian had seen all afternoon. Bellini was 62 and built like a man who had spent his 40s doing manual labor and his 50s being paid to think, thick through the shoulders, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. Not because it was trained to, but because it genuinely never had much to give. He scanned the room once, briefly, and his eyes stopped on Vivian for exactly 1 second before they moved on. He did not look at Dante. That, Vivian noted, was interesting. The gallery had gone from murmuring to the specific pressed silence of people who understood they were watching something they would be describing to other people for the rest of their lives, and were trying to make sure they got the details right. The journalists near the back row were not even pretending to take notes anymore. They were just watching with the wide, still attention of people whose brains had shifted from processing into recording. Judge Whitfield had not left the bench. He sat with his hands folded and watched the federal agents work with the expression of a man reviewing a document he found deeply uncomfortable and could not stop reading. When Cross approached him briefly to confirm the court's cooperation protocol, he nodded twice and said something Vivian couldn't hear. Cross nodded back. Professional, efficient. The machinery of federal authority running its track. Dante still had not spoken. He sat the way a very large structure sits when the load-bearing elements have been removed, technically upright, technically in place, but carrying its own weight differently now. The stillness that had always read as control was reading as something else. Vivian watched his right hand, flat on the table. She watched his index finger move once, a slow back-and-forth drag of the fingertip against the wood grain, and she recognized it. She had seen that movement before, in the house in Glencoe late at night when he thought he was alone, when he was working through a problem that didn't have a clean solution yet. It was the only involuntary thing he did, the only tell he had, and it was so small that she doubted anyone else in the room would have noticed it or known what it meant. He was scared. Not the operationalized version of fear that a man like Dante had learned to metabolize and convert into decisive action. The other kind. The older kind. The kind that lives in the body independent of what the mind decides to do about it. Naomi leaned close to Vivian's ear. The secondary warrant is for him. They're waiting on the judge's counter-signature. Should be about 20 minutes. Vivian said, "Okay. Are you all right?" Vivian considered the question with the same care she had given most questions over the past 6 weeks. "Ask me again in 20 minutes, she said. Naomi sat back. She had a particular quality that Vivian had come to rely on, the ability to be present without pressing, to occupy space in a way that was supportive without being demanding. It was a skill, Vivian thought, a real one. Not everyone had it. The 20 minutes that followed were not quiet in the way the previous silence had been quiet. They were busy in the grinding, administrative way of large legal machinery suddenly being redirected at high speed. Cross and her team moved in and out of the courtroom. Documents were handed to the judge. Gallery members were quietly asked to provide contact information before they could leave. 2 of Crow's junior associates sat at the defense table in the rigid, pale stillness of people who were running very fast internal calculations about the concept of professional association and what it meant in a federal context. One of them, the younger one, a woman in her late 20s who had been furiously taking notes on her legal pad all morning, raised her hand slightly, like a student, and asked one of the agents whether she was required to remain. The agent looked at her for a moment. "Are you Vincent Crow's employee?" "Associate, junior associate. I've been on this case for 8 weeks." "Then yes," the agent said. "For now, yes." The young woman put her hand down. She looked at her legal pad. After a moment, she turned it face down on the table. Vivian watched all of this peripherally, the way you watch things when your main attention is located somewhere else. Her main attention was on Dante. He had still not looked at her again after that first moment. He was managing himself with the focused precision of a man who had trained himself to manage in the way that professional athletes train. Not through inspiration, but through years of deliberate repetition until the management was automatic, until the face was just a surface and the surface stayed level regardless of what moved underneath it. But his finger kept moving on the table, that small drag of the fingertip against the wood grain, back and forth, slow, involuntary. Then Cross came back through the main door with a document in her hand and said, "Mr. Moretti," and the finger stopped. Dante looked up. Cross stood 4 feet from the defense table. She held the warrant loosely at her side, the way you hold something when you've carried a lot of them. "I have a federal arrest warrant for Dante Moretti on preliminary charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and criminal racketeering. I'm going to ask you to stand up slowly and keep your hands visible." The room held its breath. Dante stood up. He was even now, even in this, impressive, in the way that structures built for a long time to withstand pressure are impressive even when they are finally giving way. He straightened his jacket. He shot his cuffs once, the small habitual adjustment that Vivian had seen him make 1,000 times before entering a room or ending a conversation. He looked at Cross with the level, measuring gaze of a man who was already beginning the next set of calculations. "This is preliminary," he said. His voice was perfect, smooth and exact, and carrying nothing that could be used against him. "My legal team will have me released within 48 hours. "That's entirely possible," Cross said. Turn around, please." He turned around. The handcuffs made a sound, the small, mechanical click of the ratchet engaging, and it was the loudest thing Vivian had heard all day. As Cross walked him toward the door, he passed within 8 feet of Vivian's table. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes forward and his spine straight, and his expression arranged in the careful blankness that was the closest thing to dignity available to him at that moment. And Vivian sat with her hands in her lap and watched him pass. And she felt a great number of things, none of them simple, none of them what she had expected. She had expected something cleaner, satisfaction, maybe, or relief, or the specific emotional clarity of a door being closed. What she felt instead was complicated and heavy and not entirely pleasant. The feeling of a very long effort reaching its end point, which was not the same as the effort being over. The door swung shut behind him. Naomi exhaled. It was a short, controlled sound, but it was real. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Vivian agreed. That was the easy part. The hard part started 3 hours later, in a conference room on the 31st floor of the federal building, when the lead prosecutor on the newly opened Moretti case, a man named Aaron Delgado, 47, who had the lean, slightly haggard look of someone running on 4 hours of sleep and conviction in roughly equal measure, spread a series of documents across the table and looked at Vivian with the direct assessing gaze of a man who needed things from her and was trying to determine the best approach. "How long have you had the surveillance system running?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Since March 2017, Vivian said. Continuous recording. 6 years and 7 months of footage stored on an encrypted partition on the company's secondary server array. The partition was architecturally invisible, not hidden in the conventional sense, genuinely invisible at the system level unless you knew the specific access protocol." Delgado looked at her. "You had 6.5 years of footage." "Yes." "And you chose this specific recording." "I chose 48 recordings," Vivian said. "That was the first one. The others document specific transactions, specific meetings, specific communications. They establish pattern and practice over a sustained period. The March recording was the most direct. It was also the most recent." "Why not bring this forward earlier?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Naomi put a hand slightly forward on the table, the attorney's gesture of interception, but Vivian was already answering. "Because earlier, I didn't have standing," she said. "Earlier, he was my husband and the CEO of a company I had built, and he had effective control of my legal and financial situation in ways that would have made any action I took immediately vulnerable to suppression. I needed the divorce proceedings to create a public court-documented record. I needed his team to commit to their fraudulent evidence in an official proceeding. I needed everything on the table, in writing, under oath, before the footage meant what I needed it to mean." Delgado studied her for a long moment. "You let them run the play," he said. "I let them finish it," Vivian said. "There's a difference." Naomi kept her expression neutral, but Vivian caught the slight movement at the corner of her mouth. Delgado leaned back in his chair. He had a styrofoam cup of coffee that he'd been not drinking for the entire conversation, and now he looked at it as if remembering it existed. "Ms. Mercer, what I'm going to tell you now is preliminary, and I want you to hear it in that context. Based on the footage you've provided and the supporting documentation your attorney submitted, we are opening a RICO investigation into Dante Moretti and associated entities. That investigation is going to be substantial, it's going to be lengthy, and it's going to require your ongoing cooperation and testimony." "I understand that," Vivian said. "It's also going to require you to be very careful about your personal security from this point forward," Delgado said. He said it in the same tone he had used for everything else, level, fact-based, not trying to frighten her more than the facts warranted. "Moretti's organization has operational depth, significant operational depth. The arrest this afternoon removes the head, but the body is still functional. People in that organization are going to be very interested in how this information surfaced and what the exposure looks like." Vivian nodded. "We're going to want to discuss protective measures." "I expected that." Delgado looked at Naomi. "She expected that," he said. "She expected most of this," Naomi said. The conversation continued for another 90 minutes. It covered the authentication chain for the footage, the technical architecture of the surveillance system, the specific individuals visible and audible in each of the 48 recordings, and the documentary evidence, the financial records, the shell corporation structures, the forged signatures, the bribed expert witnesses, that Vivian had been assembling and storing on a separate encrypted system for the previous 3 years. 3 years. She had started the documentary file in 2020 when the first of Dante's financial redirects had been large enough and deliberate enough that she could no longer sustain the story she had been telling herself about what kind of man her husband was and what kind of organization she was living inside. She had not left. She had stayed, and she had watched, and she had recorded, and she had built a case with the same methodical patience she had used to build the security architecture that made him rich, because she had understood by then that the only way out of something Dante had built was to be more meticulous about it than he was. It had taken 3 years of marriage after that realization. She did not explain this to Delgado. It was not relevant to his investigation. It was relevant to something else. The specific accounting that happens inside a person when they have spent a long time living in close proximity to something that requires them to be smaller and quieter and less than they are. And they are finally in a room where that is no longer required. She was tired. She was, underneath the precision and the composure and the years of careful construction, profoundly, structurally tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day and everything to do with the accumulated weight of days before it. Naomi drove her home, not to the Glencoe house, which was now an asset in a contested estate that she could not access, but to a serviced apartment in the West Loop that Naomi had arranged 3 weeks earlier, when both of them had understood that the apartment in Glencoe was going to become unavailable to Vivian one way or another. It was a clean, spare space on the 11th floor of a building with good security and a doorman who had been briefed. There were 2 boxes of Vivian's personal items already there, books, a few items of clothing, things that had been quietly removed from the Glencoe house over the previous month through channels that were nobody's business but theirs. Naomi walked her up, stood in the doorway. "You should eat something," Naomi said. "I know." "And sleep." "I know." Naomi looked at her for a moment with the direct, undecorated concern of a person who had been in the trenches with someone for 6 weeks and had arrived at something that might eventually become friendship, if there was ever time for it. "You did something extraordinary today," she said. "I want you to let that in at some point." Vivian looked at the spare, clean room, the 2 boxes against the wall, the city lights visible through the window, the grid of Chicago spreading out toward the lake, alive and unknowing. "Not yet," she said. "Not yet." She woke at 3 a.m. from a dream she immediately lost the contents of and lay in the unfamiliar dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling, and her mind went where minds go in the 3 o'clock hours. Not to victories or strategies, but to the texture of the years behind her, the specific weight of the Glencoe house in winter, the way a particular hallway smelled, the version of herself that had walked into a rented office in Wicker Park in 2013 with an idea and 2 graduate students and a whiteboard, and had believed, actually believed, that what she was building was hers. It wasn't regret. She had made her choices with full information, and she had made them deliberately, and she would make most of them again. But that did not make the accounting painless. She got up at 5 and made coffee with the small machine on the kitchen counter, and sat at the window and watched the city come forward out of the dark, and she was halfway through the 2nd cup when her phone lit up on the counter. Unknown number. She looked at it for 2 rings before she answered. The voice on the other end was quiet and deliberate and belonged to a man she had met exactly once, at a Moretti Holdings board dinner in 2019. His name was Frank Corelli, and he was officially a commercial real estate developer on the North Shore, and unofficially one of the 3 senior capos in Dante's organization outside the direct corporate structure. She recognized his voice the way you recognize voices you have only heard once when the context in which you heard them was sufficiently memorable. "Ms. Mercer," Corelli said. Vivian put her coffee cup down. She kept her voice level. "Mr. Corelli? I want you to know I bear you no personal ill will." That's a very specific thing to call someone at 5 a.m. to say. A pause. "There are people in this organization who are going to make very poor decisions in the next 72 hours, Corelli said. Scared people make poor decisions. I want you to be aware of that. I'm aware of it, Vivian said. Are you aware of the name Thomas Reed? She was not. She kept her face still even though there was no one in the room to see it. An old habit, useful in this moment. Tell me, she said. Reed is Dante's insurance policy, Corelli said. He's been operational for 6 years. Off book. Completely off book. Not in any corporate structure or organizational chart. His function is terminal problem resolution. The phrase landed in the room like something cold. Dante activated Reed 4 days ago, Corelli said. Before the hearing. Before the ruling. He activated him as a precautionary measure because he already knew, or suspected, that something was coming. The activation doesn't automatically translate into a specific action, but it means Reed is mobile and resourced and waiting for further instruction. Vivian was very still. Her hand on the coffee cup was very still. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because I have been in this organization for 19 years, Corelli said, and I am not interested in going to federal prison for a man who is no longer capable of protecting the people who protected him. So this is a transaction, Vivian said. Everything is a transaction, Corelli said. The question is whether the terms are acceptable. After he hung up, Vivian sat for a long time without moving. The city outside the window was fully light now, the morning coming in flat and gray off the lake. And in the building across the street, she could see the small rectangle of a lit window where a person was moving around a kitchen doing ordinary morning things. She picked up her phone, called Naomi. Naomi answered on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. We have a problem, Vivian said. Tell me. There's a man named Thomas Reed. I need you to call Delgado right now, and I need you to tell him that Dante activated a contractor 4 days ago, and that contractor is currently operational. She paused. And I need you to tell him that we have a source inside the organization who is prepared to provide testimony. A beat of silence on the line. Vivian, Naomi said carefully, how solid is this source? Vivian thought about Frank Corelli's voice at 5 in the morning. The specific quality of a man who has been watching a structure he bet his life on develop cracks and has finally, quietly, decided to stop standing next to it. Solid enough, she said. But even as she said it, even as she heard Naomi begin to move on the other end of the line, something was working in the back of her mind. A small, insistent wrongness, the way a single note played slightly off-key sounds wrong in a way you can feel before you can name. Corelli had called her directly, at 5 in the morning, on a number that was not publicly associated with her. She had changed this number 4 days ago. 4 days ago, the same day Dante had activated Thomas Reed, she stood very still in the early morning light of a spare apartment with 2 boxes of her remaining life against the wall, and she thought about that, and she thought about what it meant that Frank Corelli, who was offering her information and offering his cooperation and bearing her no personal ill will, had a phone number that should not have existed yet. She called Delgado first. Then she stood at the window and waited while the city finished waking up outside and thought about the phone number, turning it over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what lives underneath it. Naomi arrived at the apartment at 7:15 with 2 coffees from the place downstairs, and the particular expression she wore when she was working through something she hadn't yet resolved. She set 1 cup on the counter without being asked, and looked at Vivian and said, Delgado is running Reed's name through the system. He wants us at the field office at 9. Good. He also wants to know how Corelli got this number. So do I, Vivian said. Naomi looked at her steadily. You think Corelli is playing you? I think Corelli called me on a number that has existed for 4 days, Vivian said. I think that number is not registered to my name and was obtained through a private security firm that Naomi Brooks recommended, and that only 3 people knew I was using. She paused. You, me, and Aaron Delgado. The silence that followed was a different quality from any silence they had shared before. It had texture to it, weight. Naomi set her coffee down. Vivian, I'm not accusing you of anything, Vivian said, and she meant it, because her voice was level, and she was looking at Naomi with the same direct, measured attention she gave to things she needed to understand rather than things she had already decided about. I'm telling you what I know. 3 people had that number. Corelli called it. That's the information I have, and I need to think clearly about what it means. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Her jaw was tight. Then she said, Delgado's office requested the number from me on Thursday. His assistant called. She said it was for the contact file. Did you confirm it was actually his assistant? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to answer the question. I called her back on the office main line, Naomi said. She confirmed. What did she sound like? Professional, efficient. She had my name, the case reference number, the correct file designation. Naomi's voice had changed. The precision's still there, but something underneath it tightening. The sound of a person reconstructing a sequence of events and not enjoying what they are finding. She knew details that should only have been in the case file, which means someone had access to the case file, Vivian said, inside the federal building. She said it quietly, without drama, because there was nothing dramatic about it. It was just the next piece of information, and it was very bad. They were at the field office at 9. Delgado was already in the conference room with 2 other agents Vivian hadn't met and a thin, precise woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office named Celia Marsh, who had the focused, slightly compressed energy of someone running multiple large problems simultaneously and managing all of them through sheer organizational will. Delgado looked like he had slept approximately as much as Vivian had. He had the same styrofoam coffee cup, or one indistinguishable from it, and the same lean, driven expression, but there was something in it this morning that hadn't been there the afternoon before. A tightness around the eyes, the specific look of a man who has received information he did not want and is now adjusting his model of the situation. He got to it directly. Thomas Reed, he said. Real name, Thomas Reed. 44 years old, former Army Ranger, 2 tours, discharged honorably in 2008. He's been operating as a private contractor in the domestic market since 2011 under 3 different LLC structures. We've had a file on him since 2019. Suspected involvement in 2 deaths that were ruled accidents. We've never been able to make anything stick. Delgado looked at Vivian. He's good, very good. The activation you were told about is consistent with signals we've been picking up for the last 72 hours. Financial movements through 2 of his known LLC accounts. Cell tower pings placing him in the Chicago metro area. A pause. He's here. Vivian absorbed this without moving. We're moving you to a secure location today, Celia Marsh said. Her voice had the quality of a statement rather than a suggestion. I understand that, Vivian said. Before we discuss logistics, I need to tell you something about Frank Corelli's call. She walked them through it. The number, the timeline, the sequence Naomi had described with the assistant's call on Thursday. She did it without inflection, without editorializing, just the facts in the order they had occurred, because facts in order were what mattered, and everything else was noise. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Delgado said, Who in this office did you share the contact number with? It wasn't directed at Vivian, it was directed at the 2 agents across the table, and at Marsh, and at the general air of the room, and it had a very specific edge in it. Not accusation yet, but the thing that lives just before accusation, the hardening of a question into something with consequences. One of the agents, young, sandy-haired, with the look of someone who took very detailed notes and was very good at his job and was now understanding that being very good at your job did not protect you from every kind of problem, said, The contact sheet was filed in the case database Thursday morning. Standard procedure. Anyone with access to the Moretti case file would have had it. How many people have access to the Moretti case file? Delgado said. As of yesterday afternoon when we opened the full investigation. The agent did a quick mental count. 14 people in this office, plus the U.S. Attorney's team. Marsh made a small sound. It wasn't quite a word. We have a leak, Vivian said. She said it simply, because it was simple, because the complexity of its implications didn't change its basic nature. It was a fact. They had a leak inside the federal investigation that had been open for less than 24 hours. And somewhere in this building or adjacent to it was a person who had passed Vivian's private contact number to Frank Corelli, which meant that Corelli's call, his helpful, cooperative, bear-you-no-personal ill-will call, had been known about, had possibly been engineered before it happened, which meant the call itself was the operation. She thought about what Corelli had said. Scared people make poor decisions. I want you to be aware of that. The name Thomas Reed delivered with the precise weight of something genuinely alarming, something designed to push the investigation in a specific direction. She thought about what she had done immediately after the call. Called Naomi, told her about Reed, told her they had a cooperative source inside Moretti's organization, a source who had Vivian's private number, a source who had been fed that number through someone inside the federal investigation, a source who had given her the name of a real contractor, a man who was genuinely in Chicago, genuinely operational, and then positioned himself as her ally. The question was not whether Corelli was Dante's man. The question was what Corelli had been sent to accomplish, what information he had been trying to extract, what action he had been trying to provoke. I need to think, Vivian said. Ms. Mercer, we need to move you to... I need 5 minutes, she said. Please. Delgado looked at her. He had the look of a man who wanted to argue and was deciding whether the argument would be worth more than the 5 minutes. 5 minutes, he said. She went to the window at the end of the hallway. The city outside was fully operational now, the morning in full run, and she stood with her arms crossed and thought with the specific, stripped-down intensity she could access when everything else was stripped away. Corelli had called her to tell her about Reed. He had positioned himself as a defector. He had offered testimony. He had also, in doing all of this, given her the strong impression that the immediate threat was physical, that the urgent thing was her personal safety, that Thomas Reed was the crisis that needed solving right now. But Reed had been activated 4 days ago, before the hearing. If Dante had wanted her physically eliminated before the footage was presented, the opportunity had existed. She had been moving through her regular patterns, staying in the Glencoe house right up until the night before the hearing. She had been, in practical terms, accessible. Reed hadn't moved, which meant the activation was not a prelude to immediate action. The activation was leverage. The activation was a threat held in reserve, a hand of cards not yet played. Dante had activated Reed the way you activate insurance, not because you need it today, but because you need to know it's available. So Corelli's call, with its urgent warning about Reed's presence in Chicago, was designed to make the federal investigation focus its immediate attention and resources on a physical security threat that was real but not imminent. While that attention was redirected, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number again. She answered immediately. Miss Mercer, a voice she didn't recognize. Male, older, carrying the careful flatness of professional neutrality. My name is not important. What I'm about to tell you is... Go ahead, Vivian said. The 47 recordings you gave to the federal court this morning, the voice said. The authentication documentation. The chain of custody. The technical specifications for the surveillance architecture. A pause, measured and deliberate. The Moretti organization has filed an emergency motion in federal court in the last 40 minutes, claiming that the surveillance system you operated inside the corporate headquarters constitutes an illegal wiretap under federal statute, that the recordings were obtained without consent, without warrant, and in violation of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. Vivian's hand tightened on the phone. The motion was filed by a firm called Hargrove and Slade, the voice continued. You may not recognize that name. It is not Vincent Crow's firm. It is a firm that has never appeared in connection with Moretti Holdings in any public filing or proceeding. It was incorporated 8 months ago in Delaware. Its named partners are both retired federal judges. She stood very still. The motion is technically substantial, the voice said. The illegal wiretap argument has merit under specific readings of the statute. If it succeeds, all 48 recordings and all associated documentation are inadmissible. The entire evidentiary foundation of the case against Dante Moretti disappears. Who are you? Vivian said. Someone who would prefer the outcome your evidence was pointing toward, the voice said. Which is why I'm telling you that the motion is not the real problem. The motion is the distraction. A pause. The real problem is the server. What about the server? The secondary server array where the surveillance system stored its recordings. It's still inside the Moretti Technologies building. Physical hardware, sublevel 2, behind the maintenance access corridor on the east wall. The voice was careful and exact. 3 hours ago, a crew entered that building under the cover of a scheduled IT maintenance contract and began a systematic extraction of the server hardware. They will have it removed from the building within the next 90 minutes, at which point the physical evidence that supports the authentication chain for your recordings will cease to exist. The hallway felt very narrow. If the server is gone, the voice said, the authentication fails. If the authentication fails, the illegal wiretap motion succeeds. If the motion succeeds, I understand what happens if the motion succeeds, Vivian said. Her voice came out steady because she made it steady, because the alternative to making it steady was something she could not afford right now. How do I know this is real? You don't, the voice said simply, but you don't have time to verify it either. The line went dead. She was back in the conference room in under 30 seconds. The server, she said, the physical hardware in sub-level 2 of the Moretti Technologies building. We need federal agents in that building right now. Delgado looked up sharply. What? Someone is extracting the server array, the hardware that holds the original recordings and the authentication data. If they get it out of that building, the authentication chain breaks and the wiretap motion they filed 40 minutes ago wins. She looked at him directly. Tell me you know about the motion. From the expression on Delgado's face, he had not known about the motion. The next 4 minutes were the fastest 4 minutes Vivian had experienced in a long time. Delgado was on his phone before she had finished the sentence. Marsh was already at the door. The two agents were pulling up building schematics on a laptop and talking in rapid, clipped exchanges with someone on the other end of a radio. The hallway outside filled with the specific, purposeful noise of federal law enforcement machinery suddenly accelerating. Vivian stood in the middle of it and understood, with a cold and very complete clarity, that she had been exactly right about Corelli's call. The physical safety warning had been the misdirection. The illegal wiretap motion, filed while every federal resource was focused on Thomas Reed's location, was the real offensive move. And the server extraction was the execution. 3 separate operations, initiated simultaneously. While she was in a federal building under protective custody, surrounded by federal agents, watching the legal case she had spent 3 years building be dismantled from 3 different directions at once. This was not Dante panicking. This was not a scared man making poor decisions in the 72 hours after his arrest. This was a contingency plan, designed in advance, executed on a timeline. He had known, not everything, not the specific content of the drive, not the surveillance system's existence, but he had known there was something. He had known that Vivian was not what he had decided she was, and he had built a response architecture for the possibility that she was more dangerous than she appeared, and he had built it carefully and deeply and over a long time, and now it was running. And somewhere inside it, Thomas Reed was still out there. And somewhere inside the federal investigation, someone had passed her phone number to Frank Corelli, and the server that authenticated everything was being physically removed from a building 11 blocks north. She pressed both hands flat on the conference table and breathed. Delgado came back through the door. His face said enough. We have agents en route to the building. 8 minutes out. How long has the crew been inside? Building security log shows the maintenance crew badged in at 7:47 this morning. It's been, he checked his watch, 1 hour and 11 minutes. The server room in sublevel 2, Vivian said. The hardware I used is behind a false panel in the east wall maintenance corridor. It is not in the main server room. If they're working from any standard building schematic or any IT documentation on file, they won't find it in 8 minutes. Delgado stared at her. Is there any other way in? There's a secondary access shaft behind the HVAC installation on the west side of sublevel 2, Vivian said, but it requires a specific bypass code to open without triggering the building's internal alarm. The code changes on a 30-day rotation. She paused. I wrote the algorithm. Do you know the current code? The rotation is algorithmic. I can calculate the current code from the base key. She looked at him. Give me something to write on. Someone put a legal pad in front of her. She wrote quickly, the numbers coming out of the part of her brain that had not stopped running even through 6 weeks of courtrooms and 6 years of surveillance footage and 3 years of careful, patient building. It took her 90 seconds. She slid the pad across to Delgado. He had it relayed to the field agents in under a minute. Then she sat down. The energy in the room was the specific, compressed energy of people waiting on information they cannot accelerate. Marsh was on a call with the federal court about the wiretap motion. One of the agents was running background on Hargrove and Slade. Delgado stood at the window with his phone in his hand and watched the street below with the tense stillness of a man who had deployed everything available and was now at the mercy of timing. Vivian's mind had moved to the next problem before the current one was resolved, because that was how the day was running, and she understood now that it was not going to stop running that way. The server was the immediate crisis. The wiretap motion was the legal crisis. The leak inside the investigation was the systemic crisis. And Thomas Reed was the wild variable, operational, in the city, activated by a man who was currently in federal custody and whose ability to give further instructions was theoretically limited, but practically, in an organization with the depth of Dante's, not absent. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen. It was a text message from a number she recognized, a number she had not heard from in 4 years, belonging to a person she had not thought about in approximately the same amount of time because thinking about him had not been something she could afford to do. The name in her contact list was simply Dr. Daniel Reyes, former senior security architect for Moretti Technologies. He had left the company in 2020 under circumstances that had been described in the official communications as a mutual parting, and had been, in reality, something considerably more complicated and considerably more painful. He had been, before those circumstances, the closest thing Vivian had had to a genuine ally inside the company. He had also been, for approximately 8 months in 2019, the closest thing she had had to something she was not going to name right now. The text said, "I know you're in federal custody. Don't tell them about the third system." She read it twice. Then she looked up at the room full of federal agents and prosecutors and the specific dense machinery of an investigation running at full speed, and she thought about what the text meant and what the third system was, and why Daniel Reyes, who had been gone from Moretti Technologies for 4 years and from her life for nearly as long, would know that a third system existed at all. Because she had never told anyone about the third system. Not Naomi, not Delgado, not anyone in any conversation she had ever had about any of this. The third system was the one she had built last, the one that was not surveillance footage and was not financial documentation, the one that was something else entirely, something she had constructed in the final year of the marriage, when she had understood that the footage and the documents were necessary but might not be sufficient. Daniel Reyes was the only other person alive who had the technical sophistication to have found it independently, which meant he had been inside her systems, not Dante's systems, hers. The question was when, and the question behind that was why, and the question behind that was whose side Daniel Reyes was on. And the answer to all 3 of those questions was something she did not have and could not afford not to have. She put the phone face down on the table and sat with her hands very still and her breathing very controlled and thought about the specific texture of the situation she was now in, which was this. The legal case against Dante Moretti was under simultaneous attack from 3 directions. There was a leak inside the investigation, there was an active contractor in the city. There was a man from her past who knew about a system he should not know existed, and every single person in this room, Delgado, Marsh, the agents, Naomi, was operating with an incomplete picture of what Vivian had actually built. Because the 48 recordings were real, the financial documentation was real, the authentication chain, if the server survived the next 8 minutes, was real. But the third system was the one Dante's lawyers could not challenge. The third system was the reason the wiretap motion, even if it succeeded, would ultimately not be enough to save him. And somebody had just told her not to reveal it. Delgado's phone rang. He answered it in one movement, listened for approximately 10 seconds, and then looked at Vivian with an expression that moved through several phases before settling. "The agents reached sublevel 2, he said. The maintenance crew was still in the building. They had located the east wall panel but hadn't breached it yet. He paused. 4 individuals in custody. The panel is intact. The air in the room shifted, the specific shift of a crisis resolving on one axis while remaining fully open on every other. The server is safe, Vivian said. For now, Delgado said. He was looking at her with the focused, slightly troubled attention of a man who was revising his understanding of a situation and not finding the revision comfortable. Vivian, I need to ask you something and I need a straight answer. Ask. Is there anything else? He said. Anything in this case? Any evidence? Any system? Any asset that you haven't told me about? The room was very quiet. She looked at Aaron Delgado, who was a good prosecutor and an honest man, and was genuinely trying to build a case that would hold. And she thought about Daniel Reyes's text, and she thought about the third system, and she thought about the 11 months she had spent building it and what it contained and why she had built it the way she had. And she made the first decision in this entire process that she made not from strategy but from something raw and less reliable and more human than strategy. From the instinct of a person who had been playing chess for 3 years and had just realized that the board had more pieces on it than she had put there. There's one more thing, she said. Delgado waited. But before I tell you what it is, she said slowly, I need you to tell me the name of the assistant who called Naomi Brooks on Thursday to get my contact number. Something changed in Delgado's expression. A small tightening. A movement behind the eyes that was not quite guilt, but was in the neighborhood. Why? He said. Because I need to know, Vivian said, whether the person who gave Corelli my number is still in this building. The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds Vivian watched Aaron Delgado's face and read what was in it with the same precision she had used to read everything else. And what she read there was not the blankness of a man who didn't know the answer. It was the expression of a man who had just understood, in the space of a single question, that someone he trusted had been in a room they should not have been in, and that the full weight of that understanding was only now arriving. He looked at the 2 agents across the table, and one of them, the sandy-haired one, the one who took careful notes and was very good at his job, looked back at Delgado with the specific terrible stillness of a person who has understood that the moment they have been dreading has finally, irrevocably arrived. His name was Kyle Brennan, 29 years old, 14 months with the Chicago field office, recruited out of Northwestern's law program, fast-tracked through the Bureau's accelerated intake process, assigned to financial crimes with a case record that had been, by every measurable standard, exemplary. He had the kind of file that made supervisors confident, the kind of face that made witnesses cooperative, and the kind of access that made him, for someone with the right leverage and the right timing, extraordinarily useful. He did not try to run. That was the thing Vivian would remember later, the specific quality of his stillness when Delgado looked at him. He sat with his hands on the table and his notes face up, and his pen still in his right hand, and he looked back at Delgado with the expression of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had arrived, with something almost like relief, at the moment when he could put it down. Kyle, Delgado said. Brennan set the pen down, parallel to the legal pad, precise. I need a lawyer, he said. The room moved fast after that. Marsh was on her phone in the hallway. The second agent, a woman named Torres who had not spoken once in the entire meeting and had apparently been watching Brennan with a calibrated attention that Vivian had not noticed until this moment, was on her feet and positioned between Brennan and the door before anyone had said another word. Delgado stood very still in the middle of the room with his arms at his sides and looked at Brennan with an expression that was not anger. It was past anger, was something that lived in the territory beyond it, colder and more final. How long? Delgado said. I want a lawyer, Brennan said again. His voice was steady, almost professionally steady. How long, Kyle? A pause. 6 seconds. 8. 7 months, Brennan said. Delgado turned away from him. Just once, just briefly. The way a person turns away from something when they need a single moment that is not visible to anyone else. Then he turned back and nodded at Torres, and Torres moved Brennan out of the room, and the door closed, and what was left was the particular silence of a space where something has just been broken that cannot be put back together. Vivian said, the Hargrove and Slade motion, the server extraction crew, the Corelli call. He coordinated all 3. He had access to everything we were planning, Delgado said. His voice was flat and exact. Everything. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at Vivian. The third system. Tell me. She told him. It took 11 minutes, and she told him everything. What it was, how she had built it, what it contained, why she had kept it separate from the surveillance footage and the financial documentation. When she finished, Delgado was quiet for a long time, and in that quiet she could see him doing the same kind of recalculation she had been doing all morning, adjusting his model of the situation along new dimensions, finding that the adjustment changed the shape of everything. It's still in the building, he said. Partition 3 of the same server array. Different access key, different encryption schema, completely isolated from the surveillance partition. Even if they had breached the panel and extracted the hardware, they would have found 2 of the 3 partitions. The third one is architecturally separated at the firmware level. It looks like unallocated storage space. Dante's people don't know it exists. Nobody knew it existed, Vivian said, except whoever Daniel Reyes is working for. Delgado picked up his phone, made 2 calls in rapid succession, each lasting under a minute, each carrying the clipped, high-velocity language of someone transmitting precise instructions under time pressure. When he was done, he looked at Vivian and said, "We need to move you now, not to the safe house we discussed. Different location, different route, 2-agent escort minimum. We are operating on the assumption that Brennan has compromised every logistical detail he had access to." "Which is most of them," Vivian said. "Yes." He paused. "I'm sorry." She shook her head once, not dismissive, acknowledging. The apology was genuine, and it was insufficient, and it wasn't his fault, and none of those things were worth discussing right now. "What about Reed?" she said. "We have a location on him as of 40 minutes ago. Hotel in Streeterville. We have surveillance on the building." A pause that lasted just long enough to carry a meaning. "He hasn't moved today, at all." "Because he's not the threat anymore," Vivian said. "He was the threat Corelli wanted me afraid of. If Dante's real play was the legal attack, Reed was theater." "Or Reed is the contingency," Delgado said quietly, "for if the legal attack fails." That sat in the room for a moment. "Move me," Vivian said. They moved her through a service exit on the building's north side into an unmarked vehicle that smelled like industrial cleaner and had a crack in the passenger side window that someone had patched with clear tape. Torres drove. A second agent named Garza, compact and quiet, and wearing the expression of someone running active threat assessment in real time, sat in the back beside Vivian. Naomi was in a separate vehicle 2 minutes behind them. The drive took 22 minutes. The safe house was a 3-flat in Wicker Park, not a federal facility, a private address registered to a name that had no connection to any ongoing federal proceeding, arranged through a channel that Brennan had not had access to because it had been arranged this morning, after Vivian's phone call, through a contact that existed outside the normal bureau infrastructure. Delgado had contingencies for his contingencies. It made her trust him slightly more than she had an hour ago, which was not the same as trusting him completely, but it was what was available. The apartment was on the 2nd floor, clean, spare, functional. A couch, a table, a window with the blinds already down, a coffee maker on the kitchen counter that someone had thought to stock. Torres did a sweep of the rooms in under 2 minutes and declared it clear, and then took a position near the front door, and Vivian sat at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Her phone buzzed. Daniel Reyes again. She answered it this time. "You found the third system yourself," she said. Not a question. 14 months ago. His voice was the same as she remembered it. Quiet, slightly careful, carrying the specific quality of a person who chooses words the way other people choose tools. "I wasn't looking for it. I was doing independent security architecture work for a client, and I recognized your structural signature in a system that should not have had your structural signature in it." "What client?" A pause. "That's complicated." "Uncomplicate it." "Vivian." "Daniel." She said his name with the flat, exact weight of someone who is done with every version of indirection available. "I am in a safe house in Wicker Park with 2 federal agents because someone inside the FBI was feeding my location to Dante Moretti's people. I have a contractor somewhere in this city who may or may not be pointed at me. I have a legal motion in federal court trying to suppress every piece of evidence I spent 3 years building. Tell me who the client was." The silence lasted 4 seconds. "Lena Corvo." he said. Vivian's hands went very still on the table. Lena Corvo was 61 years old and was officially a philanthropist and art collector with residences in Chicago and Florence, and a foundation that provided scholarships to first-generation college students. She was also, unofficially, the person Dante Moretti had been transferring significant amounts of money to through 3 layers of shell corporations for the past 4 years, in a pattern that Vivian's financial documentation had identified but not fully explained. She appeared in 2 of the 48 recordings as a peripheral reference, a name mentioned without context in conversations about money movement. She had assumed Corvo was a financial partner, a beneficiary, someone Dante was paying for a service. "She hired you to do what?" Vivian said. "She told me she was conducting due diligence on a potential acquisition target," Daniel said. "A cybersecurity firm. She gave me access credentials and said she needed an independent security review of the architecture." He paused. "The credentials she gave me were for a system I eventually realized was yours. I don't think she knew I would recognize your work. I don't think she planned for that." "What did she actually want?" "The third partition," Daniel said. "She didn't know what was in it. She knew it existed. She had enough technical information to know it was there, not enough to access it. She wanted me to extract the contents." Another pause. Longer. "I didn't. When I realized what I was looking at, what you had built and why, I stopped the job and went dark. I've been sitting on this for 14 months trying to figure out what to do about it." "And you decided to do something about it today," Vivian said. "I decided to do something about it when I saw the news last night and understood you had actually moved," he said. "I didn't think you would move when you did. I thought you had more time." His voice was careful. "Lena Corvo is not a peripheral player, Vivian. She's been Dante's operational partner for 11 years. The money he's been sending her isn't payment for services, it's capital management. She's been managing the liquidity for everything that doesn't run through Moretti Holdings. The offshore accounts, the real estate holdings in Europe, the cash reserves that don't appear in any corporate structure." Vivian sat with this. "She holds the money," she said. "She holds everything that survives his arrest," Daniel said. "If Dante goes to prison and the Moretti Holdings assets are seized, Lena Corvo is still sitting on somewhere between $400 and $700 million in assets that have no documented connection to him. The organization doesn't collapse. It reconstitutes around her." "And the third partition," Vivian said slowly, "contains the documentation that connects Corvo to Moretti's finances," Daniel said, "doesn't it? She had built it specifically for that reason. The surveillance footage and the financial records were the case against Dante. The third partition was the case against the infrastructure that would survive him. She had built it because she had understood, in the final year of the marriage, that removing Dante without removing the financial foundation of his organization was like cutting a vine at the stem and leaving the root system intact. "She needs that partition destroyed," Vivian said. "She needed it destroyed before you moved," Daniel said. "Now she needs it, and she needs it fast, because once your case is fully established in federal court, the discovery process will eventually get there whether or not you hand it over voluntarily. She has maybe 48 hours before that window closes." A beat. "She's the one who has Thomas Reed." The room tilted slightly on its axis. "Corelli said Dante activated Reed," Vivian said. "Dante activated Reed 4 days ago," Daniel said. "Lena Corvo acquired Reed's contract 12 hours ago. She paid Dante's organization for the transfer. Money to the right people. Reedy's current employer is Lena Corvo, not Dante Moretti." He paused. "Reed isn't theater, Vivian. He was never theater. Corelli sent you toward the legal threat because Corvo needed your attention away from the physical one." Her pulse had not spiked. That was the strange thing. It had not spiked because there was no room for it, because the part of her brain that managed panic had been running at full capacity for so long that it had simply stopped reporting to the rest of her. She sat with the information and processed it with a flat, functional clarity that she recognized as a survival mechanism and was grateful for. She stood up. "Garza." The agent was at the kitchen table in 3 steps. "What do you need?" "I need you to call Delgado right now and tell him Reed's operator is not Dante Moretti. It's a woman named Lena Corvo. and that Corvo is currently the operational head of Moretti's financial infrastructure and the subject of documentation in the third partition of the server we secured this morning. She was already moving toward the window, then stopped herself. Window, blinds down, stay away from the window, and turned back to the room instead. Tell him we need a warrant for Corvo within the hour. If she gets 48 hours, she's going to be in Florence, and we are never going to touch her. Garza was on his phone before she finished. Torres, from the door, "You said Reed is in Streeterville." "He was 40 minutes ago," Vivian said. "If Corelli's call was designed to direct federal surveillance toward that location, Reed has had 40 minutes to move." Torres and Garza exchanged a look that carried a specific professional meaning. "Get Delgado to pull the surveillance off Streeterville and run Reed's financial accounts for movement in the last 2 hours," Vivian said. "Hotel checkout, transportation booking, anything." Delgado called back in 4 minutes. His voice was different from what it had been an hour ago, stripped down, accelerated, running at the frequency of a man who has received 3 pieces of very bad news in rapid succession and is still, functionally, upright. "Reedy checked out of the Streeterville Hotel at 9:43 this morning," he said. 47 minutes ago. We had surveillance on the building entrance. He went out a service exit in the basement. We missed it." A pause that carried everything a pause like that carries. His most recent cell tower ping puts him in a vehicle traveling south on the 90. He is 40 minutes from Wicker Park. Vivian stood in the middle of the room and let that land. "He knows where I am," she said. "Brennan had the logistics of the original safe house, not this address." Delgado's voice was careful. "This address was arranged through a channel Brennan didn't have access to." "But Corelli's call was before we moved," Vivian said. "Before Brennan was identified. Before we changed the plan." She was thinking fast, each thought connecting to the next with the mechanical precision of a system running under load. "Brennan didn't give Reed this address. Corelli gave Reed the original address. When we moved, Reed had to find the new location another way." She stopped. "Daniel." She was still holding her phone. "Daniel," she said into it, "when you called me this morning, how did you know I was in federal custody?" A pause. "The news said you'd presented evidence and that federal agents were present at the courthouse," he said. "I assumed you said you knew I was in federal custody. Not that you assumed, you said you knew." Her voice was very even. "Daniel, where are you right now?" The pause this time was different. 4 seconds. 5. "I'm in Chicago," he said. "Where in Chicago?" 6 seconds. "That's," he started, then stopped. "Where are you?" Vivian said. "I'm outside," he said. I parked on Damon. I came because I thought you might need." He stopped again, and in the stop she heard something that was not calculation, was not professional composure, was something older and less controlled than either of those things. "I came because I've been sitting on this for 14 months, and I watched the news last night, and I needed to see that you were—" "Garza," Vivian said. Garza was already at the window, 2 inches to the side of the blind's edge, looking down at the street with the focused intensity of a person running visual threat assessment. "Blue sedan," he said. "Damon, south side. Driver's been there 11 minutes. Didn't move when we came in." "That's Daniel Reyes," Vivian said. "He's not a threat. But someone may have followed him here." Garza was on the radio immediately. Torres moved from the door to the window. "If Reed has been running surveillance on Reyes since this morning, trying to locate you, then Daniel led him here," Vivian said. She said it without anger, without any particular weight beyond the weight of the fact itself. Daniel Reyes had come to Wicker Park at 7 in the morning with good intentions and 14 months of guilt and concern for a woman he had not spoken to in 4 years, and he had been watched, and now Thomas Reed was 40 minutes south on the interstate and had a destination. She looked at Garza. "How fast can we move again?" "Now, Shum," Garza said. "Right now, if we need to." "We need to." She picked up her phone. Naomi was 2 minutes behind them. "Call Naomi's escort and tell them to hold position. Do not come to this address." Her phone buzzed. "Delgado." "Reedy's vehicle just exited the interstate," Delgado said. "He's in the city. ETA your neighborhood. 18 minutes. We're scrambling a tactical team, but they're 12 minutes out from staging." A pause. Vivian, I need you to move. I know. She was already at the hallway. Delgado, the Hargrove and Slade motion, the wiretap challenge. Where does it stand? Federal judge is reviewing it, ruling expected within 2 to 4 hours. If it succeeds, everything is inadmissible. Yes. Then we don't have 4 hours, she said. We need to get the third partition's documentation into evidence before that ruling comes down. If it's already in the federal record, it doesn't matter whether the wiretap motion succeeds. The financial evidence against Corvo is independently obtained. A case, different system, different legal framework. It stands on its own. Delgado was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. You're right. I need remote access to the server, Vivian said. I can authenticate and extract the third partition remotely. I need 30 minutes and a secure connection. We can set that up. Set it up at wherever we're going. She looked at Torres. Move. They went out through the back of the building, down a fire stairwell that smelled like cold concrete and something chemical, into an alley that ran behind the row of 3 flats toward a parallel street. Garza had a vehicle positioned 60 meters east, not the same unmarked car they had come in, a different one. This one, dark green, parked nose out in a spot between a bakery truck and a recycling container. The morning air was cold. October in Chicago, the kind of cold that gets into fabric immediately and stays there. And Vivian was in a blazer over a light shirt, and the cold hit her skin like a hand, and she moved faster without being told to. They were in the vehicle in under 90 seconds. Torres drove. Garza in the back again, beside Vivian, on his radio with short bursts of information moving in both directions. The city outside moved past the windows, the way cities move when you are inside a vehicle that is traveling faster than traffic. In discrete, disconnected frames, each block a separate image, people on sidewalks with no idea of the specific geometry of events threading through the streets around them. Vivian's phone buzzed. Daniel Reyes. She answered. I'm still on Damon, he said. Do I need to move? Get off that street right now, she said. Drive north. Don't use GPS. Don't stop. Call me in 20 minutes. She paused. And Daniel, whatever Lena Corvo hired you for, whatever you did or didn't do for her, whatever your exposure looks like, I need you to be available to testify. Can you do that? A silence that lasted long enough to mean something. Yes, he said. Then drive, she said. She ended the call. Garza's radio crackled. A voice she didn't know, fast and tight. TAC team is 9 minutes from staging. Subject vehicle last confirmed 2 miles south, still mobile, no deviation from projected route. Vivian did the math, read 9 minutes from the address they had just left. Tactical team 9 minutes from staging, plus deployment time. The window between those 2 arrival times was thin and getting thinner. Delgado, she said. Garza handed her the radio. The secure connection. How long? 5 minutes from now, Delgado's voice said. We're setting up at a secondary location. Do you have what you need to authenticate? I have the access key in my head, she said. I don't need anything else. Then we're ready when you arrive. She handed the radio back. The vehicle turned onto a broad, fast street heading north, and the morning opened up in front of them. The city in full daylight, enormous and indifferent, running its 10,000 parallel lives in the bright October cold. 14 minutes later, they were in a conference room on the second floor of a building she didn't recognize, in a neighborhood that was not Wicker Park, and there was a laptop open on the table connected to a secured federal network, and Delgado was standing behind the chair, and Vivian sat down and cracked her knuckles once, a childhood habit she had never fully broken, and put her hands on the keyboard. She typed the access protocol from memory. 43 characters, alphanumeric, case-sensitive, structured around an encryption key she had generated herself in a rented office in Wicker Park in 2022 at 2 in the morning with a cup of cold coffee beside her and the absolute certainty of a woman who understood that what she was building was not a weapon but a final door, and that she might someday need it to open when everything else had closed. The system connected. The third partition loaded. 2,047 files. Wire transfers. Account statements. Property titles in 6 countries. Corporate structures mapped across 4 legal jurisdictions. 11 years of financial architecture built to survive any single catastrophe. Arrest, prosecution, asset seizure, intact and operational, and completely invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Lena Corvo's fingerprints on every one of them. "Start the transfer," Delgado said. Vivian hit the command. The progress bar appeared. 43% complete. 51. 60. Garza's radio went off. The voice on the other end was clipped and very fast. "TAC team on scene at Wicker Park address. Subject's vehicle located 1 block east. Subject not in vehicle. Repeat, subject not in vehicle. We are doing a sweep, but..." The radio cut to static for 2 seconds. Then, "Contact, north side of the building. Subject is..." Static. "Garza." Torres's voice from the door, sharp and immediate. Vivian looked up from the screen. The progress bar read 78%. "Keep transferring," Delgado said, his voice carrying a quality she had not heard from him before. Not panic, something adjacent to it. The voice of a man making rapid decisions about competing priorities. He was already moving toward the door. Vivian looked at the screen. 78%. She put her hands back on the keyboard and held very still and thought about Thomas Reed and the tactical team and the building in Wicker Park and the radio going to static. And she thought about 83%, 87, 91, and she kept her breathing level and her hands still, and she watched the number climb. 94%. The door at the end of the hallway opened. It was not Delgado who came through it. It was a man she had never seen before. Tall, lean, wearing a jacket over a dark shirt, moving with the very particular economy of someone for whom the geometry of rooms and the position of bodies in those rooms is professional information. His eyes found her immediately, the way eyes find things they have been looking for, and for one moment, one suspended, airless moment, the room contained only the two of them and the laptop on the table and the progress bar on the screen reading 96%. Thomas Reed looked at the laptop. He looked at Vivian. "Step away from the computer," he said. His voice was the same voice that would give directions on a highway or order coffee in a diner. Completely without texture, completely without anything that could be called emotion or intention or anything human at all. 97%. Vivian did not move. 97%. The number sat in the corner of the screen like a heartbeat. Vivian did not move her hands from the keyboard. She did not look at the progress bar again. She looked at Thomas Reed, who was standing 8 feet from the table and was very still in the way that specific kind of professional is still. Not relaxed, not tense, simply present in the room with the complete, uncomplicated attention of a person for whom this situation is a technical problem and not an emotional one. He was not holding a weapon. That was the thing she registered first, and then she registered why, and the why was that he did not need one. He was bigger than her by a significant margin and faster, and trained for exactly this kind of room, and she was sitting in a chair with a laptop on a table, and the math of the situation was already complete, and he already knew the answer. "I said, step away," he said. "I heard you," Vivian said. His eyes moved to the screen for exactly 1 second. Progress bar. Reading the number. Then back to her. He moved. He covered the 8 feet in 2 strides, and he was fast. Faster than she had calibrated for. The movement carrying the kind of condensed efficiency that cannot be faked and cannot be acquired except through years of deliberate practice. And his right hand came down on the laptop lid and pressed it closed with a force that was precisely sufficient and no more. The way a person closes something when they understand the mechanism and have no interest in destroying it, because a destroyed laptop is unrecoverable evidence and an intact one is negotiable. His other hand closed on her left forearm. Not hard. Not violently, with the exact pressure required to communicate that the conversation about moving was finished. She had known this was coming. She had known it the second the door opened. She had needed 4 seconds. 4 seconds was what 97 to 100% required. And she had not had 4 seconds, and so she had done the other thing. The thing she had built into the system 3 years ago for exactly the reason that she had understood, building it, that there would be a scenario in which she could not finish. At 97%, the system had triggered an automatic push protocol. Incomplete transfer. Whatever had moved across in those 97% of the file, 1,985 of the 2,047 files, 11 years of Lena Corvo's financial architecture, imperfect and incomplete but vast and specific and devastating, had been received by the Federal Secure Server on the other end and time-stamped and logged. The transfer was not complete, but it was enough. She did not say this to Reed. She let him close the laptop. She let his hand stay on her forearm, and she sat very still and breathed and thought about the timestamp on the Federal Server and the 1,985 files and what they contained, and she held that thought the way you hold something fragile in conditions that are trying to take it from you. Reedy reached for the laptop with his free hand. The door at the far end of the hallway opened, and then the door to the room opened, and two things happened simultaneously. Delgado came through at a velocity that was not quite running, but was everything immediately before it, and behind him Torres with her service weapon drawn, and Garza from the hallway with his weapon up and his voice carrying the flat, carrying authority of a federal officer in a professional situation. FBI, hands now. Both hands where I can see them. Reed let go of Vivian's arm. He straightened up. He turned toward the agents with both hands raised to shoulder height, palms forward, fingers spread. The gesture of a man who has done this calculation and arrived at the answer, who understands that the window he needed closed 60 seconds ago, and that what lives on the other side of it is a different set of problems entirely. His face was exactly what it had been when he walked through the door. Neutral, technical, carrying nothing you could use against him. Torres had him against the wall in 15 seconds. Garza took the laptop off the table and held it against his chest like something with value. Delgado stood in the center of the room breathing hard, looking at Vivian, and she looked back at him and said, "The transfer was at 97% when he closed it." Delgado stared at her for 1 second. Then he was on his phone. The confirmation came back in 4 minutes. 1,985 files received, authenticated, time-stamped, logged in the federal evidence system at 10:47 in the morning on the 15th of October. Incomplete transfer. 62 files missing from the total. Delgado looked at Vivian. "What's in the 62 missing files?" "Real estate holdings in Florence," she said. 3 property titles and a set of corporate transfer documents. She paused. She can't run to a property that's in the federal evidence record. Even without the titles, the transaction history in what transferred will lead any competent prosecutor to the addresses. It just takes longer. How much longer? 2, 3 weeks, Vivian said. Get an Interpol flag on Corvo's passport today, and it doesn't matter. Delgado nodded once and got back on his phone. Thomas Reed was walked out of the building in handcuffs 18 minutes after he had walked in. He passed within 4 feet of Vivian in the hallway on the way to the federal vehicle, and he did not look at her. Not from hostility, not from shame. He simply had no particular interest in her now that the operational problem had resolved, and the lack of interest was in some ways more frightening than hostility would have been. He was a man who had come to do a job and had found the job unavailable, and would, with the same level of interest and effect, eventually go somewhere else and do a different one. She watched him go. Naomi arrived at the building 40 minutes later, brought by the second escort team, and she came through the door and stopped when she saw Vivian and took one long breath and then crossed the room and put both arms around her and held on for a moment without saying anything. And Vivian stood in that and let it happen and felt somewhere in the back of her chest something that had been compressed and rigid for a very long time released by a single degree. "Are you hurt?" Naomi said. "No." "Are you sure?" "My arm," Vivian said. "He held my arm. I'm fine." Naomi pulled back and looked at her with the direct, unsentimental attention of a person conducting a real assessment. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They sat at the table for an hour while the federal machinery around them processed itself. Reports, chains of custody, arrest protocols, the administrative weight of a morning that had produced multiple arrests, a compromised federal agent, a foiled evidence extraction, and the largest single addition to an ongoing RICO case file in the Chicago field office's recent memory. In that hour, several things were resolved, and several things became clear. Kyle Brennan had been turned 7 months ago through a debt. Private, substantial, the kind that accumulates quietly when a person makes a series of decisions they cannot take back, and then makes one more to try to cover the first set. Corelli had found him through a network of financial intermediaries that the FBI would spend the following weeks mapping. Brennan had provided case logistics, location data, and the contact number. He had not, it turned out, known about Reed. He had believed his role was purely informational. This did not make his situation better, but it made him more immediately useful as a cooperative witness, and by afternoon he was talking to federal prosecutors with a thoroughness born of a man who has finally, with great relief, stopped trying to manage the unmanageable. Frank Corelli formally requested protective custody at 11 in the morning through an attorney he had apparently had on standby for exactly this contingency. He was, it turned out, not a reluctant defector turning against a failing organization. He was a man who had been surveilled for 2 years by a separate FBI financial crimes unit, working a parallel investigation into Moretti's operations, a unit that Brennan had not known about and therefore could not compromise, and who had been approached by that unit 3 months ago and given a timeline. The call to Vivian had been coordinated with that unit as a way of testing Brennan's leak pathway. Corelli had known about Brennan, Delgado had not. The left hand and the right hand of the federal investigation had not been communicating fully, and Vivian had been the instrument through which that gap had been found and closed, and this was not how Delgado had wanted to discover the problem, and his conversation with the other unit's lead agent, conducted in a hallway outside the conference room, was brief and not warm. The Hargrove and Slade motion was denied at 2:17 in the afternoon. The federal judge reviewing it found that the surveillance system operated by Vivian Mercer constituted a protected proprietary security architecture under the company's own internal governance documents that Dante had signed as CEO, authorizing unlimited access to all company security systems by the company's founding architect. He had, in effect, authorized Vivian's access to her own system 9 years ago and never rescinded it. Crow had known about this. The motion had been filed anyway because it was all that was available, and it had failed the way things fail when they are built from desperation rather than substance. Daniel Reyes called at 3 in the afternoon. He was parked on a street in Lincoln Square, having driven north, and then continued driving for reasons he described as not entirely rational. "Is it done?" he said. "Most of it," Vivian said. "Are you okay?" She considered the question with the same honesty she had been applying to everything else all day. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a month." A pause. "Vivian, I should have called you 14 months ago." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I didn't know how to." "I know," she said. "Come to the federal building on Dearborn tomorrow morning at 9. Ask for Aaron Delgado. Tell him everything you told me and everything you didn't tell Lena Corvo, and answer every question he asks you completely." She paused. "If you do that, the 14 months won't matter as much as it could." A long silence. "Okay," he said. "And Daniel." She stopped. The thing she wanted to say was present in her chest, specific and old, carrying the weight of 2019 and the rented office in Wicker Park and the 8 months of proximity and the way things end when they end because the structure around them cannot hold them. She held it for a moment. Then she put it down. "Thank you for not extracting the partition." She ended the call. Lena Corvo was detained at O'Hare International Airport at 4:41 in the afternoon, 3 hours and 20 minutes after the Interpol flag was issued on her passport, having booked a same-day business class seat to Rome under a name that was not her own but was linked to a travel document that federal financial analysts had found in the transaction history of the transferred files 45 minutes after receiving them. She had not been running, or rather, she had been running in the specific, organized way of a very careful person who had planned for the contingency of needing to disappear, and the plan would have worked if the financial trail had not already been in the hands of people who knew what they were looking at. She was 61 years old, and she stood in the international terminal with her carry-on luggage and her Italian leather coat, and the precise, composed expression of a woman who had managed an empire's finances for 11 years and was not prepared to display anything other than composure now. And she said nothing when the agents approached her except to request her attorney, which she was entitled to do. And she was escorted out of the terminal with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized every federal action that day. Dante Moretti heard about Corvo's arrest from his defense counsel in the federal detention facility at 5 in the evening. Whatever response he had, it was private. The attorney who reported it to Delgado's team said he had sat for a very long time after being told, looking at the wall, and had not asked any questions. The empire he had spent 20 years building had begun to consume itself from within, exactly as empires do when the weight they have accumulated exceeds the structure's ability to hold it. Capos made calls to attorneys. Financial officers who had been told by their own counsel to stay quiet began reaching out through intermediaries to federal prosecutors. The offshore account managers who had operated through Corvo's shell structures started the process of calculating whether the structures could survive the exposure of the woman who had built them, and the calculation came back negative, and some of them began, quietly and with great attention to their own continued liberty, to talk. The machine had stopped, not all at once. Machines like this do not stop all at once. They wind down the way large things wind down, with noise, with friction, with pieces coming loose in irregular sequence, with the specific grinding sound of a system designed for sustained operation, trying to continue after the core has failed. It took weeks. It took the better part of 3 months, through autumn and into a winter that came early to Chicago that year, cold and direct off the lake. But it stopped. The federal trial began in the spring. It lasted 11 weeks. Vivian testified for 4 days, not dramatically, not with the theatrical weight of a woman completing a vendetta, but with the precise, steady competence of a technical expert providing a court with the information it needed to understand what it was looking at. She described the architecture of the surveillance system. She explained the authentication protocols. She walked the jury through the financial structure that Corvo had maintained on Dante's behalf, file by file, account by account, with the kind of patient exactitude that comes from understanding that the truth, presented clearly, does not need enhancement. She was cross-examined for 2 days by the defense counsel that had replaced Vincent Crowe, a firm from Washington that had taken the case with the measured optimism of lawyers who had not yet seen the complete evidence file. By the afternoon of the second day, that optimism had taken on a different quality. The lead attorney, a silver-haired man from Georgetown, stopped asking questions that invited her to expand and started asking questions designed only to minimize, which is what lawyers do when they understand that the witness cannot be cracked, and the best available strategy is containment. Vivian answered every question directly. She did not elaborate when elaboration was not required. She did not allow herself to be baited into anger or defensiveness or any of the emotional registers that would have made her easier to characterize as something other than what she was. She was in those 4 days exactly what she had always been, and what Dante had never fully credited, the most technically capable person in the room. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The verdict was delivered on a Thursday in April, at 11 in the morning, with spring rain running down the courthouse windows and a crowd of journalists filling the plaza outside, and the gallery packed with the specific mixture of people who attend the endings of large things: attorneys, investigators, family members of people who had been hurt by the organization over its 20-year run, representatives from the financial institutions that had been defrauded, and ordinary people who had been following the case the way people follow things that confirm something they have always believed about power and its relationship to accountability. Dante sat at the defense table in a gray suit that was still expensive, but now fitted differently. He had lost weight in the months of detention, and the suit that had once looked like it was made for him now looked like it was made for a slightly larger version of a man who was no longer available. He sat straight. He kept his face level. He was, to the end, a man who understood the importance of presentation. The judge read the verdict counts in order: racketeering, conspiracy, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, bribery of a public official, criminal conspiracy, money laundering. On each count, the foreperson said the same word, and the word was the same word, and the weight of its repetition accumulated in the room the way weight accumulates, not suddenly but steadily, each instance adding to the one before, until the total was not a surprise but was still, somehow, definitive. Guilty. 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 Vivian sat in the gallery, third row, left side, beside Naomi, who sat with her hands folded in her lap and her expression carrying the contained, complex satisfaction of a person who has spent the better part of a year in the service of something she believed in and has arrived at its conclusion. When the last count was read, the room shifted. The specific shift of a space in which something large has been decided, a subtle reorganization of the air, the way a room feels after a window that has been stuck for a long time is finally opened. Dante turned in his chair. He looked for her. She had known he would. She had known it the way you know the last note of a piece of music you have been listening to long enough that the ending is not a surprise, but is still a resolution. He turned and he found her in the gallery, and he looked at her across the room with the expression of a man who has arrived, through a long and expensive process, at a genuine reckoning with something he had previously been able to avoid. It was not quite regret. It was something more structural than that. The expression of a person looking at the consequences of decisions they made deliberately, understanding that the consequences are correct, that the accounting is accurate, that the number that has been arrived at is the right number. Vivian looked back at him. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. 3. She was waiting for something to arrive in herself. The satisfaction, the relief, the particular emotional clarity she had been telling herself would come at this moment. Instead, what arrived was quieter and less resolved and more honest than any of those things. It was the feeling of a very long effort arriving at its endpoint, which carries with it not only what has been gained, but the full inventory of what has been spent. The years, the specific quality of the life she had lived inside the architecture of his empire, the choices she had made and the cost of making them, and the fact that cost is always real regardless of whether the choice was right. She looked away first, not because she couldn't hold his gaze, because there was nothing left in it worth holding on to. The sentencing came 6 weeks later, 41 years. Dante Moretti, age 53, would be eligible for parole review in 29 years, at which point he would be 82 years old. The judge, delivering the sentence, used language about the sustained and systematic nature of the conduct, about the depth of the corruption and the breadth of the harm, that was precise and without drama and carried the weight of 11 weeks of evidence in every syllable. Lena Corvo received 22 years. Vincent Crowe, 24. Kyle Brennan, facing a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation, received 7 years and the particular persistent weight of having made a choice he would carry for the rest of his life, regardless of when he got out. Marco Bellini, who had cooperated most fully and most early, received 14 years and a deal that his attorney described as the best available outcome, and that Bellini accepted with the expression of a man who understood it was. Frank Corelli received a suspended sentence and 5 years of supervised release in exchange for his cooperation with the parallel financial crimes investigation, which had been running for 2 years before Vivian had ever walked into a courthouse, and which, thanks to the information surfaced by the Moretti case, ultimately produced 8 additional indictments across 4 states. He disappeared from public life entirely, and Vivian never heard from him again, which was exactly how she wanted it. Thomas Reed was charged with breaking and entering, criminal trespass, and interference with a federal investigation. His attorney argued that he had not known the building was the site of a federal proceeding and that his actions amounted to a civil trespass. The jury disagreed. He received 4 years, which was less than what his presence in that room had felt like in the moment, but more, Vivian suspected, than he had expected. Aaron Delgado was promoted 6 months after the trial. He called Vivian the morning the promotion was announced and said, in the direct, slightly awkward way of a man who is more comfortable with facts than sentiment, that the case had been the most significant of his career and that she had been, and he paused here, looking for the right word and apparently not finding the one he wanted, so he used a different one, extraordinary. She thanked him and meant it. Naomi Brooks was named a partner at her firm in December, a recognition that had been coming for several years, and that the Moretti case had simply made impossible to delay further. She and Vivian had dinner the week it was announced, at a restaurant in the West Loop that neither of them had been to before. And they sat across a table with 2 glasses of wine between them and talked for 3 hours about things that were not the case. About Naomi's daughter, who was 12 and played cello with a seriousness her mother found both admirable and slightly alarming, and about a trip Vivian was considering, nothing specific yet, just the idea of going somewhere that had no particular weight attached to it. "Where are you thinking?" Naomi said. "Somewhere I've never been," Vivian said. Somewhere that doesn't know anything about me. Naomi looked at her with the warm, direct attention that was the particular quality of her friendship. You could also just stay, she said. Chicago knows what you did. I know, Vivian said. That's part of the problem. She smiled when she said it. Naomi smiled back. They split the check with the unself-conscious practicality of two women who had both been through enough that the performance of gesture was no longer interesting. Mercer Global Security was incorporated in January, 6 months after the trial ended. The name had been chosen before the verdict. Vivian had filed the incorporation documents on a Tuesday in October, the morning after Dante was found guilty, with the same legal efficiency she applied to everything. The company was built on the new operating system she had completed during the divorce proceedings, an architecture that superseded every product Moretti Technologies owned, and that the board of the former company had spent 3 months trying to license before Vivian declined and walked away because she had spent 9 years building things for other people's names and was finished with it. She hired 11 people in the first month. All of them knew what she had done. None of them knew all of it, and she preferred it that way. Daniel Reyes was not among the 11. He had testified, as she had asked. He had told Delgado everything, including the 14 months of sitting on information he should have surfaced immediately, and he had answered every question fully, and the federal prosecutors had determined that his involvement with Corvo's operation was insufficient to support charges given his ultimate refusal to complete the assignment and his voluntary cooperation. He had walked out of the federal building on a cold November morning, a free man, which was the right outcome. He had sent her a message the following day. 4 words. I hope you're well. She had not responded. It wasn't anger. It was something more complicated and less dramatic. The understanding that some things belong to the specific time and condition that produced them, and that trying to bring them forward into a different time and condition does damage to the original thing. The 8 months in 2019 had been real, and they had mattered, and they were finished, and she wanted them to remain exactly what they were without the addition of whatever would come after. She let the message sit unread in her phone for a week, then deleted it. She thought about him sometimes, less as the months went on. The Glencoe house was sold at auction in March as part of the estate dissolution, and a family from Minnesota bought it and immediately began renovating the kitchen, and Vivian saw a photograph of the renovation on a neighborhood social media account one afternoon, and felt almost nothing. A faint, distant recognition, the way you recognize a place from a dream. She closed the photograph and went back to work. The penthouse on Lakeshore Drive was purchased by a tech entrepreneur from San Francisco who was relocating to Chicago and who had apparently no idea of the property's history. Vivian hoped, for his sake, that he was comfortable with high ceilings and very good security. She moved into an apartment in the West Loop in February. 11th floor, south-facing, a view of the city that she spent the first 3 mornings sitting at and not working. The apartment was spare and clean and entirely her own in a way that the Glencoe house, for all its size and expense, had never quite managed to be. She bought a good coffee maker, and 2 chairs, and a desk, and a bed, and the specific, deliberate minimum of things that a person needs when they are starting from the ground up and do not want the weight of accumulation. She put nothing on the walls for a month. Then, in March, she hung one thing, a framed printout, matted in white, of a section of code. The access protocol for the third partition. 43 characters. It looked, to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, like abstract art, just lines of text, just numbers and letters in a specific arrangement, carrying no obvious meaning. She knew what it was. That was enough. The last time she was in a courtroom in connection with the Moretti case was for a brief evidentiary hearing in May, 14 months after the divorce proceedings that had started everything, routine and procedural, and over in under 2 hours. She wore the pale gray dress she had worn the morning of the original verdict, not as a statement, just because it was what was at the front of the closet, and she was running late, and she didn't think about it until she was already in the car, and then she thought about it for a moment, and then she let it go. After the hearing, she stood outside the courthouse on the plaza, and the morning was genuinely warm for the first time that year, the kind of May morning in Chicago that arrives without warning after a long, grinding winter, and makes the city look like it was designed to exist in this specific quality of light. The lake was visible between buildings, a narrow, bright band of blue-gray. She stood in the sun for a moment, just that. Naomi came out behind her and stood beside her and said nothing, And Vivian looked at the city and felt the warmth on her face and breathed, fully, without any particular difficulty, without managing the breath or monitoring it, just breathing the way a person breathes when they are not thinking about anything except the fact of the air and the warmth and the specific quality of a morning that does not owe them anything and is offering itself in any way. "Breakfast?" Naomi said. "Yes," Vivian said. They walked east toward the river, and the city moved around them the way it always moved, enormous, indifferent, full of its 10,000 parallel lives running their separate threads in the bright May morning. And Vivian walked through it with her hands in her coat pockets and her face in the sun, and she did not think about Dante Moretti, who was in a federal facility in downstate Illinois, learning the long arithmetic of the years ahead of him. She did not think about the empire she had watched collapse from the inside out, or the 3 years of patient construction, or the 48 recordings, or the server in sublevel 2, or the 43-character key she had generated alone at 2 in the morning with cold coffee and absolute certainty. She thought about where to have breakfast. She thought about the trip she was going to take, the one with no particular destination yet, the one that was just the idea of elsewhere, of a place that did not know her name and had no investment in her story and would receive her simply as a person moving through space in the ordinary, unhistoric way of someone with nowhere in particular to be. She thought it might be time. She thought it might finally be time.